This is Speaking Freely with the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm Andy Hoover, your host and Director of Communications at the ACLU of PA. In October, we released a new report called Cold Reality: Uncovering the Cruelty and Chaos of ICE Practices in Pennsylvania. The report is an analysis of documents obtained from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, and what they show about the harm that ICE enforcement actions do to families and communities. Here to talk about it are Vanessa Stine, Senior Staff Attorney for Rights at the ACLU of PA, Laura Perkins, Human Rights Organizer with Casa San Jose in Pittsburgh, and Professor Caitlin Berry of Villanova University School of Law and the Director of the law school's Farmworker Legal Aid Clinic. Vanessa and Caitlin were co-authors of the report, and Laura helped with pre-report briefings with community members and provided feedback before its release. This conversation was recorded on December 10th. Laura, Caitlin, Vanessa, thank you all for joining and taking the time to talk about this in-depth report that this team, the three of you and a team of others, put together documenting ICE practices in Pennsylvania. And we'll get into the details of the report. But before we do, I want to give each of you a chance to introduce yourself. So, Laura, why don't we start with you? You're with Casa San Jose. Tell us a little bit about your organization and what you do there.
Hey everyone. Yeah, Laura, she, her pronouns. I'm the human rights organizer at Casa San Jose. We are based in Southwest Pennsylvania. We primarily serve the Latino population of that area. We are. I want to be clear that we did not write this report at all. We are so appreciative of this report, but that was Vanessa and Caitlin and their teams. I'm particularly interested in this report because I think it'll share a roadmap for maybe what we could see in the next 4 years, and it's just amazingly written. So happy to be here.
Great, thanks. And Caitlin, how about you? You're with the Farmworker Legal Aid Clinic at Villanova Law. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Right. So I direct the Farmworker Clinic. It's a law student clinic where my students and I represent workers in the food system across Pennsylvania. So we represent individual workers and families, and we also work with farmworker-led organizations on campaigns to address issues that impact immigrant workers broadly.
Vanessa, sorry.
Vanessa's a former student in the Farmworker Clinic, which I have to include.
That's great. Thanks for that. I did not know that. So Vanessa, I think people are listening to this, they probably know what the ACLU of Pennsylvania does, but your title is Senior Staff Attorney for Immigrants' Rights. That also may sound self-defining, but why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do day to day?
So our immigrant rights work is focused both on expanding the rights of immigrants in Pennsylvania and also protecting or vindicating those rights. And so a lot of our work is focused on challenging unlawful conduct by local or state actors. So that can look like if there are police stops where ICE is being called or the police are collaborating with ICE. And then we also do a lot of work in the detention context, both challenging when people are held in immigration detention unlawfully, and also in highlighting some of the unlawful and inhumane conditions that people are detained in an immigration detention. When that type of immigration detention generally is unnecessary because it's civil in nature, meaning people are not supposed to be subject to conditions that look like punishment, and yet that's what we see a lot of the time in immigration detention centers throughout the Commonwealth.
So let's get into the report. It's called Cold Reality: Uncovering the Cruelty and Chaos of ICE Operations in Pennsylvania. And Caitlin, why don't we start with you? The team obtained and analyzed nearly 2,000 documents from ICE. What were those documents and what is on them that is important?
Sure. So the documents that we obtained through FOIA, first through filing a request for records and then litigating after our request was denied. Huge thanks to the firm of Grogan and Langer who litigated that case with us. We were successful in obtaining over 2,000 records. These are records that are called Form I-213. They're essentially the arrest records that are prepared by the Department of Homeland Security. In this case, we were requesting records for people who had been arrested in Pennsylvania by ICE, which is the agency that's primarily responsible for enforcing immigration law away from the border. We were told during the litigation that there were over 16,000 arrests that had taken place between 2016 and 2020, which is the time period we were looking at. We selected a sample of those records, a really robust sample of just over 2,000 records that we reviewed. And an I-213 form is essentially similar to a police report. It's supposed to be the form where an officer who has conducted an arrest would record basic information about the person, demographic information, height, weight, their address, things like that. And then there's a narrative portion where they would explain what happened during the arrest. One of the reasons that these records are so important is that they are the primary form of evidence that ICE will use against a person in deportation proceedings to prove their undocumented status based on the information that the officer claims they collected during the arrest. So understanding what these forms are and how to challenge them is really crucial.
So knowing that you had these forms, you're getting information, you're seeing the information, them doing an analysis of them 2,000 of these documents. Vanessa, what did the analysis find?
We had a couple of main takeaways from our analysis. The first is that ICE arrests here in Pennsylvania disproportionately target Latin American men of color who work in low-wage industries, which contributes to the abuse of workers trapped in exploitative positions throughout the Commonwealth. Another takeaway is that ICE officers knowingly separate parents from children in nearly 1/3 of all arrests. And I just want to note here that that's just where the ICE officer bothered to note that the person is a parent. So that number is likely higher than 1/3 of all arrests. The most common ICE arrest tactic in the community is car stops. And we're talking about where ICE stops cars here. We're not talking about police car stops. And so what that looks like is that ICE interrogates both the driver and passengers. And, by doing so, they routinely violate people's civil rights because they're making warrantless arrests and often continue to ask investigative questions even after purportedly locating their target or not at all, meaning they often wait until there's lots of people in a vehicle to pick them up so that they can have like a gotcha moment and get everybody. We also saw a lot of state and local law enforcement collaboration, which both at the police department level and also in jails throughout the Commonwealth. And, those can often run afoul of the Constitution because local law enforcement have no authority to enforce civil immigration laws. And then on the jail side, ICE detainers, which is often the mechanism in which ICE will request for a jail to continue to hold somebody for immigration purposes, is just a request. It doesn't abide by the Fourth Amendment because it's a detainer that's signed by an ICE officer, not a judge. And so, but we saw a lot of that type of collaboration. We also saw a lot of collaboration, again, I just mentioned this, but with local police who call ICE to the scene during a traffic stop. And a lot of that is under the guise of needing help to verify somebody's identity, which conflates two separate issues, which is verifying someone's identity, which police can do without the assistance of ICE, and trying to verify someone's immigration status, which is what ICE does. Those two things are separate. So, police have tools and access to information to verify when they need to someone's identity. But we also saw a lot of overstepping here where, police officers were not just requiring identity documents from the driver, but also from passengers, and then using that information to turn it into an immigration enforcement action where they're gathering people's information and then contacting ICE and holding people. The last takeaway that I want to highlight is, we saw a lot of consistent practices about incomplete or inaccurate or sloppy completion of the I-213 forms. And the reason that this is noteworthy and important is goes back to what Caitlin mentioned earlier, which is the government uses the I-213 forms as their main form of evidence against somebody in removal proceedings. And yet, if there's systematic issues with how ICE officers are completing those forms and there's missing and inaccurate information, that calls into question the reliability of those records as evidence of a person's immigration status or evidence against them in removal proceedings.
And I want to come back to particularly the workplace issues and the local law enforcement issues momentarily. But before we do, Laura, I want to ask you a little bit about Casa San Jose and the work you're doing. Casa San Jose runs a hotline to help immigrant community members in need. And through that work, you've encountered people with experiences like those in this report. I'm sure some of the things you saw here were not surprising at all. Tell us about what you've observed about ICE practices and how it impacts community members.
Yeah, Casa San Jose started our ICE detention hotline 6 years ago, and I've been running it for the past 6 years. So we are on call 24/7 to respond to ICE detentions in Southwest Pennsylvania. ICE detentions happen so quickly that only once have we actually been able to physically be on the ground for an ICE detention, because they're often in and out with in under half an hour, and to get somewhere in Pittsburgh with the tunnels and everything. So this report is so important because it provides us with information that we really can't. It's really difficult to get. But I do want to highlight what Vanessa said that or indicated, which was that the source of this information is an ICE agent, and so while it's something, it's obviously pretty biased on what happened in each ICE detention. So in Pittsburgh, when we respond to the report of an ICE detention, we often get our information from the family members. When did they leave for work? And who were they with? I want to highlight in the report, it talks about collateral detentions, which we saw a lot of in the past Trump administration, which really complicates figuring out what has happened to someone, because what we saw a lot of was that we would get a call from a wife saying, my husband hasn't come home from work. He's usually home from work at this time. And so we kind of start asking questions like, all right, well, has he had an interaction with police recently, right? But they say no. And so it's like, all right, well, who does he usually ride to work with? And oftentimes it was because someone that the individual rides to work with had a police interaction recently, and the police called ICE on one person, but then they followed that person, they detained everyone in the vehicle. It was probably the most common scenario that we encountered in Pittsburgh. Other things that really in the report that really resonated with our experiences are people speaking with ICE and not knowing that they're ICE agents, and they will give ICE agents personal details without ever knowing who they're speaking with. We heard that account many times. And also, when we talk about state police or police collaboration, I think Pennsylvania State Police are a big one of the biggest contributors to the, collaborating with ICE. But a lot of, especially national campaigns, talk about the 287G program, which is a formal interaction, an agreement between ICE and police departments. But at least in Southwest Pennsylvania, we see a lot of informal interactions, not an agreement between the police department and ICE necessarily, but ICE or police officers calling ICE after an interaction, but it's often not in the police report. Nothing is even written in the police report about that. So yeah, those are a lot of things that we see in Southwest Pennsylvania that are highlighted in the report.
So I want to stay there. Let's stay there on law enforcement for a moment. First of all, the people not knowing they're talking to ICE, are these ICE officers? I think I saw something in the report about how they wear shirts that say police, which then gives the impression that you're talking to your, local township or city PD as opposed to federal officers. Is that what we're describing here? Are ICE officers posing as something else, or what's how does that play out? I'm curious about the details.
So that is a common pattern. That's a tactic that's been documented that ICE uses across the country. In Chicago, there was a lawsuit against ICE for carrying out the types of car stops that Vanessa described, where they would wear vests that said police and take advantage of the expectation people would have, as you're saying, that they assume it's a traffic stop. They're going to be asked about something that happened with the car and then released. Not knowing that they're actually speaking to an ICE officer. There have been some attempts to require them to wear some sort of indication that they're actually immigration officers, but it is a common tactic that ICE uses, and we did see that in these records as well.
And
Vanessa, sorry, Laura, go ahead.
Well, even more recently, we had an incident at a jail where an ICE agent entered the jail with the jail's permission and interrogated the individual, and only at the end of the conversation did the incarcerated individual know that they were speaking with ICE, because there's so many officials in the jail and they really didn't understand what was going on.
Vanessa, Laura mentioned the Pennsylvania State Police, and the data, as Caitlin said in this report, is from 2016 to 2020, which is interesting. Internally, we're like, well, this data is 4 years old, but on the other hand, in light of what the next 4 years may bring, it's obviously quite relevant. But with the state police, we actually had litigation against the state police, and it would not surprise me if some of the incidents referred to here were actually maybe even part of that litigation. But the bottom line is, we did settle with them. And so I guess the question is, where does that stand? Or do we feel confident that settlement what's the enforcement there, and what are the restrictions now on the state police?
Yeah, thanks so much for raising that. We did file a lawsuit against this Pennsylvania State Police, and a lot of the traffic stops that we saw that resulted in ICE collaboration in the report are very much what happened to the 10 plaintiffs that we represented. So the fact pattern is basically state police pulling people over for purported traffic violations, and then quickly pivoting and asking people about their immigration status, and then detaining the driver and passengers, sometimes for hours at a time, in order to investigate their immigration status. And that normally meant waiting for ICE to come to the scene. And so at that, those detentions, we challenged and argued that they were unlawful. We did successfully settle that case for a large monetary amount, and also successfully negotiated a new policy that prohibits troopers from prolonging stops to conduct immigration checks, and from running immigration checks when verifying a person's identification. And it also makes clear an overarching part of the policy is that state police are not responsible for enforcing civil immigration law. So that means they generally should not be doing inquiries into a person's immigration status. The policy also agrees that or also affirms that ICE detainers, which is what I mentioned earlier, which is a request from ICE asking that the person be detained until ICE can take them into custody, does not provide a lawful basis for detention or arrest on its own. And so that's also an important part of the policy. That policy is still in effect, and we hope that the policy continues to be followed. There was some monitoring about a year post settlement where we were getting reports so part of the policy also requires officers to write a report anytime they do contact ICE, and that's really to try to get at making sure they're not doing so in violation of the policy. And so we did monitor all of those reports and reviewed them for a year, and largely saw compliance with the policy. There were a few I would describe as more sort of like technical issues that we highlighted, but we have not heard or seen about any sort of systemic issues following the policy. But it's certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye on. But it's also, that's just the policy for the Pennsylvania State Police. We have many police departments in Pennsylvania, and the policies vary greatly, if at all, if there are any policies on the books. But I do just want to say, it's greatly important for police to distinguish themselves from and to disentangle from any temptation to try to enforce civil immigration law, not just because it's bad policy from a public safety perspective, because it confuses the roles of police and ICE. They have, different jobs and different mandates for what they're supposed to be doing, but it also can expose police departments and municipalities to liability, because that sort of collaboration where police are in prolonging somebody's stop to investigate somebody's immigration status is unlawful under the Constitution, and they expose themselves to liability. That the PSP settlement, the state police settlement, was a little over $800,000 that they had to pay in damages to our clients and in attorney's fees, and so it can be a costly endeavor beyond the policy implications, where it's just not smart to do either.
And what you're describing there sounds like there needs to be a degree of political will from the elected officials in municipalities, or at the state level too, for that matter, to draw those clear lines. Yeah, Laura, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I can say what that looks like locally in Allegheny County. We actually got a grant and hired someone to do a series of right to know requests to local police departments on their immigration policies and also their interpretation and language access policies. Allegheny County has about 100 geographically based police municipalities, and about 130 total, including like university and hospital police and stuff like that. Of the geographically based ones, a lot of them did not respond to our right to know requests, and we didn't have the legal power to respond to all of those. And a lot of them also just didn't have any written policies, as Vanessa mentioned, which makes it harder for advocates to hold police accountable to a policy that doesn't exist. But we saw very few police departments actively had a written interpretation policy, or a policy that says they do not enforce civil immigration law. But a few actually had an active policy that encouraged police officers to reach out to immigration and customs enforcement.
Caitlin, I'm going to switch over to workplace enforcement. And the report does talk a bit about that and ICE activity and enforcement in workplaces. Can you say a little bit about the details that the report shows? And also, what is the impact of that kind of enforcement in the workplace?
What we did see when we looked at these records were that there were not mass workplace raids at the scale that we saw in some other states. Mississippi, Tennessee, among others, they had massive raids at job sites where hundreds of workers were arrested in one day. I remember one of the statistics in Mississippi were that 20% of the children didn't show up at school the next day, like really, really massively destructive actions. We didn't see raids at that scale in Pennsylvania, thankfully, and I hope we never will. But we did see the targeting of low-wage workers, as Vanessa talked about. We saw some smaller group arrests, mostly at food producers, so restaurants, farms, meat processing facilities. There was one arrest that received some media attention, where officers went to a farm claiming to be searching for a particular person. They had a piece of paper with a person's name and work address on it. And when they presented it to the people working at the farm, they said, "You're in the wrong place. This is not that address. That farm is in a different location." And the officer said, "Oh, well, we don't care. All of the Latino workers should get in line." So just sort of clear racial profiling, as usually is the case with workplace raids. So we did see some of those smaller group arrests in Pennsylvania. There was a group arrest at a mushroom farm in Chester County. The more common tactic that we saw were arrests that would target workers in other locations. So as Laura and Vanessa were describing, ICE officers might go to a home, sit outside the home, surveilling people coming in and out of the home, sometimes for hours, often until a car would come to pick the person up for work. And then officers would follow the car, either wait until they had gotten some distance away and then pull the car over and interrogate everyone in the car. Or occasionally they would follow the car to the job site and try to grab people coming in and out of the workplace. The most common occupation that the ICE officers recorded on these records is laborer, followed by construction and cook. So they're clearly targeting low-wage workers who are doing most likely some of the most dangerous and exploitative work in Pennsylvania. And the targeting of workers has really severe consequences. Obviously, most importantly, for the person being arrested, who's now facing losing their home, their livelihood, possibly permanent separation from their family, from their community. The consequences go beyond that person because immigration enforcement can harm all workers at a particular job site. Immigration enforcement against workers deters people from reporting mistreatment or abuse that can then allow employers to exploit workers with impunity. And someone's hired at a job site and there's already a culture there that employers are taking advantage of workers. And so it can harm anyone who's then joining that job site. It can disrupt worker organizing and unionizing efforts, which would benefit all workers. We've all seen these campaigns fighting for higher wages, better working conditions. Immigration enforcement can make community leaders disappear. It can disrupt by taking away the members who are part of that organizing effort. And it can create a culture of fear where people are afraid to speak out because they don't want ICE to be called on them. Enforcement can also normalize surveillance and physical abuse in the workplace. And then the general turnover that's created, employers can take advantage of that by replacing workers with other people who might then be afraid to speak out or are going to be willing to work for a lower wage. There's this racist myth that gets circulated all the time about immigrants stealing jobs, when immigration enforcement is actually disruptive for all workers and can harm everyone's rights in the workplace. So while we didn't see the sort of mass raids, we did see a lot of targeting of workers that I think would have significant consequences across the state.
So the report identifies a lot of problems. It also has some recommendations. So Caitlin, can you tell us a little bit about those recommendations?
Sure. And this is where I would say Laura and other organizers at immigrants' rights organizations across the state really did contribute to the report. All of these recommendations came from meetings and discussions that we had with organizations throughout the time we were working on the report. So the first recommendation is that there is a blanket dismissal of all deportation proceedings for people who were subjected to civil rights violations during their arrest. As Vanessa mentioned, we saw systemic issues with local police enforcing immigration law unlawfully, with immigration officers racially profiling people, with really sloppy and poor collection of information on these records that are then going to be introduced as evidence of a person's status. So our first recommendation is that people who are subjected to these civil rights violations, their deportation proceedings should be dismissed immediately. The second recommendation is to address these policies at the federal level that allow officers to racially profile and carry out state violence against people who are immigrants. We all know we're in desperate need of revision of the immigration laws. The New Way Forward Act was a proposal that was introduced several years ago with a lot of support from community organizations that would address a lot of the systemic issues that we saw reflected in the records that we reviewed. And so a recommendation is to support that act and moving forward. The next recommendation, going to all of the issues that Laura and Vanessa highlighted with collaboration with local police, would be to prohibit that collaboration at the state and local level. There are a number of different ways that we saw that collaboration, the primary being the sharing of information, that officers would call ICE and share people's personal information. They would call ICE to the scene of a traffic arrest and have ICE interrogate someone on the spot. ICE also has access to many of the databases that state and local police use. And that's another primary way that state and local officials are sharing information. And so we're calling for an end to that collaboration as well. Closing detention facilities in Pennsylvania would address many of the issues that we saw here, where the demand to fill beds in prisons and jails drives a lot of the mass arrests that we're discussing. So closing those detention facilities, we would hope would reduce the number of arrests that we're seeing. And then Our last two arrests, Laura could speak a little bit more about, would be to fund universal representation for people in deportation proceedings in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Immigrant Family Unity Project is a pilot project to provide universal representation for people who are challenging their deportation proceedings. They have been doing an incredible job representing people across the state, but they don't have the funding to provide full universal representation. And so calling on state and local governments to continue funding that program. And then our last recommendation is to make driver's licenses available to all Pennsylvania residents. The Driving PA Forward Coalition has been advocating for this in Pennsylvania for years. Pennsylvania is the only state in the Northeast that does not have driver's licenses for all residents. And providing residents would address some of the issues that we saw in these records, where local police would frequently use the fact that someone did not have identification as an excuse to call ICE, which is really a ruse because ICE is not in the business of checking people's identification. They're in the business of making immigration arrests. But given that that was the excuse, we would hope that if people were able to have state-issued identification, that would allow them to more safely interact with law enforcement.
So it won't surprise the three of you or anybody listening to this that since November 6th, one of the questions we keep getting at the ACLU of Pennsylvania is, what can I do? And Laura, you're an organizer and you hear all these recommendations, and I'm sure you're thinking what I'm thinking, which is this requires political will and community involvement. So if people want to get involved, what do you recommend they do?
I encourage folks to get plugged in with their local immigrant organization. We have a statewide coalition called Pennsylvania Immigrant Coalition. And their website is paimmigrant.org. They coordinate a lot of our statewide efforts, including the driver's license campaign, and they are very much involved in the universal representation campaign. We need fundraisers. I can plug our local bond fund that Casa San Jose helps to coordinate. We want to get people out of immigration detention so they can fight their case from home. And they can hopefully get the services of one of the PIFAP attorneys, but it's a lot easier to fight. And you get better results when you have a PIFAP attorney by your side and you are able to be working in with your family and gathering documents, not in detention and inhumane conditions. So I really encourage people to visit paimmigrant.org. I'd be happy to connect with folks. Even if you're not in Southwest Pennsylvania, feel free to reach out to me. My email is laura@casasanjose.org, LAURA. There's a lot of ways to get involved. So I say find your passion. We need people to meet with police departments and talk to them about their policies. I want to plug another report that was made a while ago, but by the Scheller Center for Social Justice called Dismantling ICE in Pennsylvania. I use that as like my guide on how to talk with local officials and police departments on how they can enact lawful policies where local police departments and municipalities don't collaborate with ICE.
So we've said a few times about the next 4 years, and we know that what Donald Trump has said he plans to do. Vanessa, I want to turn to you now to talk a little bit about what we're expecting. I don't want to predict the future necessarily, but we know that Trump has pledged to institute what he's calling mass deportations as soon as he's inaugurated. As a senior staff attorney for immigrants' rights here at the ACLU of PA, how are you preparing for that eventuality, and what does fighting back look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to say, we're focusing at the ACLU of Pennsylvania about what we can do here in Pennsylvania. And so, we do have a national immigrant rights project at National ACLU that, for example, they litigated the family separation case and many other sort of large national cases against DHS during the first Trump administration. And, I think we can expect to see if there's large sort of national changes that are ripe for litigation of seeing our national office taking lead in that work. But here in Pennsylvania, we've been doing a couple of things. The first is helping to provide technical assistance and advice both to community organizations who are pulling together Know Your Rights materials and who are also working to shore up policies at the local level to strengthen and implement any policies that can help protect immigrant communities. And so we've helped draft policies or review policies, and as well as looking at Know Your Rights materials and advising on that as well. The second is about technical assistance to immigration providers, and we're interested in pulling together a set of templates immigration practitioners who are challenging for example, the constitutionality of a client's arrest in the immigration context, meaning in the removal proceedings, because sometimes there are ways to do that as a defense in and of itself. We want to help create some guidance and materials for immigration practitioners as we anticipate an uptick in immigration enforcement. And an uptick in aggressive immigration enforcement is really an uptick in rights violations, because it's very challenging to have wide-scale mass deportations, or whatever you want to call them, without being in a bit looser and more indiscriminate in how you enforce the immigration laws. And when you do that, ICE officers are going to violate people's rights. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And so we want to make sure that we can be helpful to immigration practitioners who are looking at those. And then for our litigation strategies, we're both looking at, where we can jump in fast-moving cases to help throw a wrench in the deportation machine, and also challenging unlawful pattern and practices that come up by government actors. And so it's sort of twofold. It's both about trying to slow down or put a pause on the deportation machine, especially when there's questions of lawfulness involved. And then it's about investigating unlawful patterns and practices by government actors, and then challenging those practices to try to put an end to them.
Yeah, our legal director has made reference to this distinction between we'll be challenging the Trump administration directly, and also challenging what he calls Trumpism, which is local and state government officials who may be inclined to support Donald Trump's ideas. And we want to be on the lookout for those and be prepared to stop them. So, well, thank you all. Thank you, Caitlin, Vanessa, Laura. Really appreciate your time and your insights. And this is a fantastic report, and we'll be encouraging folks to check it out. So thanks again. That's Laura Perkins of Casa San Jose, Vanessa Stine of the ACLU of PA, and Caitlin Berry of Villanova Law. You can read the report Cold Reality at aclupa.org/ICE 2024. And you can learn more about Casa San Jose at casasanjose.org. Most episodes of Speaking Freely are available on YouTube. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel with the handle ACLU-PA. The ACLU of PA is now on Blue Sky. If you're a part of the Blue Sky community, be sure to follow us. Our handle is aclupa.org. That brings episode 92 to a close. The editor of Speaking Freely is Natalie Montero. Our opening theme is by Moody Finn, and our closing theme is by Elliot. Both are courtesy of bensound.com. The executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania is Mike Lee. I'm Andy Hoover. Until next time, be free.